Hi friends, Jeffy G here. If you've been following my channel, you know I've made a few videos on some old synthesizers that I own, and there's really no strategy going on here. Two of them are just older synths that I tried to sell many years ago, and nobody seemed to want, so I decided to keep them. I've done a video on the XP30 from Roland, and all of the presets and features that it has, and it got a pretty good response. Similarly, I've got a Roland Sonic cell, which is a very useful module, but lately there's a stranger in my Roland Rack. Yes, until recently I've never owned a DX7 from Yamaha. Back in the late 80s and 90s, a drummer friend of mine had a DX7 and he let me use it all the time. So for probably a decade I played that DX7. I used it in cover bands, I used it for recording. I got really familiar with it, and it was my introduction into FM synthesis. And it was a pretty old keyboard. It was from 1983. Shortly after that, I downloaded Dexed, which is a free virtual instrument that is exactly the same as a DX7. The advantage of Dexed is that it comes with hundreds and hundreds of presets. You can create your own carts. The visual representation is much easier to program than it is to navigate the menus on a DX7, especially with those thin film buttons. Well, it was a bit of a mess, and it still is. Some things don't work on it. It was very dusty. There's a lot of noise coming from the headphone amp and the output circuitry, but it essentially works. Once I got the DX7 all hooked up, I wanted to compare it to the Dexed app that I've been using for the last 12 years or so. So I fired up Logic and I created a multi-instrument that would send program control information to the DX7, just like I've done for all of my other synths. Now, if you don't know how to do that, I've created a detailed video on how to create a multi-instrument for external synths within Logic in the environment that'll give you access to all of the patches and banks. There's a link to that up above and in the description down below.
Well, the first thing to test this out was I created a track using Dexed. And you'll see a MIDI file that I dragged in here. It's actually a Chicago song. And I just opened Dexed. I chose this preset called Tree Piano. Very traditional DX7 sound. The next step was to create an environment MIDI instrument. Go to Window and open the environment. And you'll see this is the object I created. I called it DX7. If you double click on it, you'll see I've entered in all of the patch names for the first 32, which are the factory presets. And I could have loaded these in a couple different ways, but because there was only 32, I figured I would type them in. And the second 32 are on a cartridge. I think it's cartridge B. And these names, again, I just typed them in. It was faster. The DX7 only has room for these two sets of 32. So you can choose whatever sound you want. Let's say I choose E piano, and I get to hear it. By making it assignable, clicking on that assignable button, on this track, I can choose what patch is going to be played. So I can choose, let's say, Flute 1, and listening to this track, I'm wrestling with the signal strength. At the moment, I'm taking audio from the headphone output, and that headphone amp in the DX7 sounds pretty crispy. So keep in mind that this MIDI is being sent from this track to the actual DX7, and the DX7 analog signal is coming back through my audio interface. So just, you can hear the difference between these two. Here's Dexed. And here's the actual DX7. So naturally, the difference between the two is the preamp circuitry or the amplification that's coming from the DX7. And I told you this thing was a mess to start with. It needs some cleaning up, and that could be in the amplifier circuitry for the headphone amp. To access the environment, you have to hold down the Option key and go to Open MIDI Environment. And there's the object. And there are all the presets, which I mentioned I've entered in. If I choose a different preset, like I can play any of these presets. And I'm just playing these on my standard MIDI controller. The MIDI is being routed to the DX7, so I'm not actually playing the DX7, but I'm getting the DX7 sounds, that flute. Even playing the presets, you can hear some artifacts.
So when I inherited this DX7, I found that the patches that were on it were a mishmash of stuff. It was missing the factory presets, and a lot of the settings were out of whack. For example, the transposition had been set to a semitone lower, and the tuning of the thing was out of whack, and I wasn't sure whether the previous owner had made all those mods or what had happened, but I wanted to restore it to factory setting.
Another thing I had to get is this SysEx Librarian, which is a free utility that will send the SysEx information from its file on your hard drive to the DX7. So you can change the 32 presets to anything you like by adding the appropriate SysEx file, of which I have hundreds because they came with Dexed. So that gives you the option of changing what the first 32 presets are going to be. Update the patch list. So if you change these first 32 to something different that you like, you're going to have to change these names so the names correspond to the right patches.
So I got online, I looked up how to do that. I restored the factory settings. I loaded up the original factory 32 presets, and the 32 presets that come in one of the ROM cards were already there, so I plugged that in. So I'm back to the start, back to day one. And in doing so, it was an interesting retrospective just listening to, typing in the names of those presets and realizing that back in 1983, this was the dawn of a new sound that influenced music for a couple of decades. Now today, FM synthesis is common. There's lots of synthesizers you can buy, both virtual and physical, that include FM synthesis as a source. Now that I've got the DX7 all working, I still may take it apart and fix some of the problems. A good cleaning with a vacuum and some contact cleaner might improve the sound quality. My gut tells me that I'm going to continue to use Dexed and other FM synthesizers that I have in my collection that are virtual. For example, from Arturia, it has a DX7 emulation synth, and it's pretty darn good. Even Logic has an FM synthesizer built into the Retro synth. And if you have Vital or Serum or Pigments or any of the major synths out there today, you'll find that they all offer FM synthesis. So to get those classic 80s DX7 sounds, you really don't need to have a DX7 anymore. So now with the Foreigner in my Roland Rack, it begs the question, will I use it? I don't know. Hard to say. I like having the external synths. They do have their purpose from time to time, but I don't know how much I'll use them. If you found this video useful, click on the like button. Consider subscribing to the channel. I do have certain goals in mind, and the subscription count is part of that. So if you want to help me out, click on subscribe, click on the notification bell. If you have opinions on, am I diluting the Roland Rack by including a Yamaha DX7, add your comments. I'm curious what you think about it. Thanks for watching.